Well, hello, everybody. Welcome to another live stream of my podcast. And today I'm joined by Professor James McGrath. And today we're going to be discussing John of History, Baptist of Faith, the quest for the historical baptizer. The link to get the book is in the description below, and the History Valley Amazon affiliate link is in the description below, and it's also pinned in the live chat as well, so you can go order the book from Amazon. It comes out officially on Amazon in 2 days, so you can get your copy, pre-order it, and it'll be on its way. And that being said, it's good to have you back on the show, James.
Always just great talking to you. So yeah, I don't know who's the person who's been on your show the most often, out of curiosity. Is there a tally? Like, is there a scoreboard?
Yeah, that's actually a good question.
You can get us being really competitive. It's like, how come you've been on more than
Yeah, actually, I don't think I've kept track of that recently. So like I don't know the exact number. I mean, there was at least a couple of people that's been on often, for sure. But yeah, I'm going to start us off with this. How does one methodologically discern between that which is history and that which is faith-based?
You froze there for a second.
I did.
I'm guessing you were going to say methodologically or something. But
I'll repeat my question.
Yeah, sorry.
On my end, you're also breaking up too, at least in the video feed. So I don't know what's going on there. But anyway, how does one methodologically discern between that which is history and that which is faith-based?
Oh, that's a great question to start off with. And want to give a hello to I Fish in a Tie, who said they're a Butler Bulldog for life, and so got to give them a shout out. Don't know that anyone's identified as being a Butler Bulldog in the chat on this before, so happy to see that. But yeah, so this book really does try to engage directly a bit with the methodological questions about how we do history, and to not lose hold of the more classic methods of sifting through things and evaluating them piece by piece, but also to bring into account some of the recent work on memory and how it works, to bring into the picture of how I approach John the Baptist the insights that Dale Allison in particular has been spearheading in the field of New Testament and historical Jesus studies, which is that the gist of memory tends to get more right than the details, right? If we don't remember the gist correctly, then the details we're even less likely to. And so looking for the gist of a figure is more likely to get us to the ballpark. That doesn't mean that we can bypass needing to take a close look at individual sayings and things like that. It just means that even when we may not have something that we can pinpoint as, okay, here we think this is precisely what John said, if we see the ripples that John caused sort of spreading out in multiple directions, and there are some commonalities among them, often those kinds of things can lead us back towards the historical figure and their impact. As for separating sort of the individual and faith, on the one hand, I think that the issue of the history of religious interpretation of a figure having the potential to distort them, to transform them in radical ways, that's never going to go away. On the other hand, I feel like in recent studies of the historical Jesus, and again, I tried to take this into account when approaching John, there's no sense in which we can get back to a sort of a pre-faith stage, right? Because Jesus as a human figure seems to have been a person with a very profound faith, with some sort of theological beliefs about himself, as well as about the era in which he was living. And so there's likely to be at least some continuity between how an individual views themselves and how their followers perceive them in most instances, right? It may not always be the case, but if you have someone who thinks highly of themselves and the followers are not convinced, then they're probably not going to be an ongoing movement. And if a person has no religious self-understanding, then it's unlikely that anyone will come up with one, right? Now, the followers may decide, oh, this person kept denying that they're the Messiah, but that's just because they're really humble, right? Whether you're thinking of Monty Python or the recent Dune movie, you get that as a sort of a feature. But those are precisely the kinds of things that historians can wrestle with. So taking into account the distorting character of faith has to go hand in hand with the recognition that sometimes it's precisely because there is this trajectory of religious interpretation of a figure's significance that goes back to the beginning that is the reason that we have any memory of them in the first place.
How is John the Baptist understood in Q?
Yeah, so Q is a subject of significant debate, but I think it's very clear that John the Baptist is central to Q. And if the Q material, right, which everyone agrees existed, was a Q source, which is the question of debate, then John the Baptist featured, I think, as a central component, right? You've had the suggestion made more than once in the history of Q scholarship that the material about John the Baptist is a secondary accretion. And I think that's unlikely to be correct for a number of reasons. One is, while it's possible that new material can be added at the beginning, it would be very strange for a Jesus-focused collection of sayings to then be prefaced sometime later with material about John the Baptist. And if the historical impression that Jesus was a follower of John the Baptist and that he started out as part of John's movement is correct, then the question of how Jesus relates to John is going to take us back to some of the earliest phases of the development of this material and of this tradition. And so I think there are good reasons to expect John the Baptist to be central. And when we take that seriously, then we end up with an introduction that is about John the Baptist and how Jesus relates to him. And then John keeps reappearing. And even when there are points at which John is not explicitly being mentioned, we can see how themes related to John or related to the question of how Jesus and John relate to one another are there throughout. And so I think that the Q source probably was about John and Jesus, right? And was never at any point in its development just about Jesus.
Are Mandaean sources useful in the quest for reconstructing the historical John the Baptist?
Oh, that might be the most controversial thing that I argue for in this book. So far, having tantalizingly suggested that in the popular biography that I wrote, Christmaker, so far have not had people just dismissing it out of hand and saying, well, okay, James has finally gone off his rocker. We knew, we were suspicious to begin with. I think that one can make the strong case for their importance and the appropriateness of using them, not in the way that a past generation of scholars did, not in the way that Richard Reitzenstein and drawing on his work Rudolf Bultmann did, plugging them in as New Testament background as though these sources were older than or contemporary with our New Testament sources. But just as there was a pendulum swing from using rabbinic sources uncritically to avoiding using them as background, and hopefully we're getting to the point where now we can say they're later, but they're not irrelevant just because they're later. I'm hopeful that the same thing can be said about Mandaean sources. And the truth is that if we didn't have the Mishnah, if we didn't have some things that showed us the development of Rabbinic Judaism, we'd have that embedded, right, with linguistic difference between it and the surrounding commentary on it. And so we'd be able to reconstruct earlier phases in the development of the rabbinic literature. And we haven't had that kind of analysis of Mandaean sources, right? Mandaean studies is still bizarrely, bafflingly, still in its infancy as far as the amount of scholarly attention to these sources. And so I'm hoping, if nothing else, that my book will serve as an invitation to more scholars in related fields to come and dabble in this one, because it's not going to be the case for the foreseeable future that anyone is going to be just working on the Mandaeans and is going to be hired to do that at some institution. But people working on the New Testament can bring them into the picture and can contribute in the process to the study of Mandaean sources. And I'm hopeful that that's the case. That's going to be the case, I should say, going forward.
Are there overlaps between what the Q source said about John the Baptist and what the Mandaeans have said about John?
Yeah, so there's certainly some substantive overlap. There's not a lot of overlap in the sayings attributed to John in the Gospel of Luke. I'm trying to think if I'm misremembering this. In terms of things that are explicitly attributed to John in Mandaean sources and explicitly attributed to John in the Gospel of Luke, what we have is just what I'd call thematic overlap, right? There's a lot of focus on concern with social justice, economic justice. Some of those same themes are there throughout. So much so that you could put the two together into one source and have it feel like you might not notice any disjuncture. Source criticism would be a real nightmare if that were the case. They're so similar. That said, there are these really tantalizing points of intersection. So there are things that are not attributed to John the Baptist in Mandaean sources, but are part of Mandaean teaching, like, when you give, don't let the right hand know what the left hand is doing, right, which gets attributed to Jesus in the gospel tradition. And it is entirely possible that the reason why that becomes part of the Christian tradition and part of the Mandaean tradition is because it goes back to John the Baptist, right? And so there are cases like that. And then when it comes to the Gospel of Luke and Mandaean sources, the other major point of intersection, it's not words attributed to John, but there are these connections with the at the level of the infancy stories, right? So I can't remember. I think it was A Fish Called Wanda, and then there was a sequel to it where it was like the same characters meet but under different circumstances. And the Mandaean version and the Lucan version seem like that, right? Because you have Zechariah, you have Elizabeth, you have John, and there are some notable similarities, right? Zechariah is a priest in both, but the actual narrative is really, really different. And so I think there too, there's a very, very strong likelihood that there is a common source behind Luke and the Mandaean Book of John. And there too, there needs to be more study of that. Each of the chapters in this book could have been a book of its own. And I've said that more than once. The reason why I didn't do that, part of it was I had a sabbatical and I wanted to get this done. But part of it was nobody actually wanted a multi-volume series on John the Baptist yet, right? Except for me and a very, very small number of other people. And so I thought, do it at this level. But if nobody else jumps in to do these things, then I could see myself working on the infancy traditions and developing that in a much more detailed monograph that digs even deeper.
What sources did the Mandaeans have for John?
Well, that's a huge question, and because what we have are the Mandaean sources in their current form, it's very hard to answer that question. Whether it will ever be possible to do source criticism that will really unveil underlying tradition is hard to say, but there are some things that point in a positive direction, right? So one of them is that in the Great Treasure, the Ginza Rabbah, which is the main Mandaean sacred text, there's a section of essentially proverbs that are attributed to John. And the preface of it has this same formula, right, in the name of the great life and things like that you get at the start of each section of a Mandaean text. But then immediately after that, it has another introduction saying these are the teachings of John, the son of Zechariah. And it seems as though that might have been a separate source. The John the Baptist focused material in the Mandaean Book of John. There's a very recent article by Edmondo Lupieri suggesting that material might have been independent at one point, right? And that there might have been a version of the Mandaean Book of John that really was focused just on John, and that the material at the start and at the end might have a separate history. And so here too, someone who wants to get have credentials that will poise them well to teach Gnosticism, but also teach New Testament and early Christianity, could work on this, right? And I mean, it's definitely has the makings of, at the very least, a doctoral dissertation, a monograph for some senior scholar who wants to work on this. So I think that those are two very promising places to look. One other thing that came to light as we were working on the Mandaean Book of John edition was that there's a difference in grammar in different sections of this work, which indicates that it's composite, right? It's not all from the same time period. And separating the parts that date from different time periods, we identified parts as belonging to different time periods, but we didn't try to say, okay, if we put all those together, could they be a separate source that then was incorporated into this compilation? And so there too, there's something that really deserves investigation, that is just ripe, open, and ready for somebody to just jump in and get a really interesting publication out of it.
How does Salvi Soderbergh's work on the Coptic Psalms of Thomas point to the core teachings of Mandaeism predating Manichaeism?
Yeah, so I think those Coptic Psalms of Thomas, if the traditional authorship, the association of them with Thomas, who was one of the apostles of Mani, if that could be confirmed, then that would put Mandaeism before him, because clearly there's a derivation there. If they are a later compilation, then it would still be clear that Mandaean material develops independently of Manichaeism and is being drawn on by Manichaeans, because that compilation has just some material that is laced through with Mandaean themes, names of celestial beings, things of that sort, right? So there's uncertainty about the exact date and authorship of that, or who was responsible for bringing about that collection, which makes it harder to say as definitively as we otherwise might. But if that is even if that's just an early collection, right? If we could get closer, maybe through additional grammatical study of that work, of some of the features of that in Coptic, if anything like that can help us narrow down the date, then that too would affect things. There was a long while when it was thought that Mani might have actually been a Mandaean, right, in his upbringing, and that theory has been largely set aside due to the mention of Elkasai, right, in the more recently discovered Manichaean works. But that said, it seems like the Elkasites probably were a Christian group that stood closer in some ways to John the Baptist's influence than what became mainstream Christianity. And so there too, I think we have part of an important part of the picture in terms of trying to triangulate back on John. I think that his influence on the Elkasites, as well as on the Mandaeans, and through the Elkasites on Mani, even if Mani was reacting against that, all of that can be useful in helping us to triangulate back on John the Baptist.
Why did Jacob Neusner castigate those who cited rabbinic sources?
Yeah. I think the thing to say is that Jacob Neusner castigated far and wide lots and lots of people and lots of things. And there certainly was a lot of misuse of rabbinic sources by New Testament scholars. There are still some who would do that. And I think the important takeaway is that most of the thinking of New Testament scholars on Mandaean sources comes from an era when figuring out how to deal with those sources and with rabbinic sources and with other, somewhat later and non-Christian sources, how to deal with those in an appropriately critical way, right? Because if you are drawing on material that's not from your own field and there hasn't been extensive work that is using the tools of historical critical investigation, then you might be at a loss, right? Because if others are not doing it and you don't feel like you can step into that other field and do it yourself, then what do you do except potentially either cite those things or not cite them? And so there is something that's really challenging there. And past New Testament scholars did rather poorly in that regard in trying to, they saw the relevance of these materials but didn't know what to make of them. Neusner's reaction strikes me as an unhelpful one, in as much as, he said, you should treat these things as products of the time that they're in. Well, that's true, and that's true of every piece of literature. But just as we can legitimately hope to get behind the New Testament Gospels, let's say, and say something about a historical Jesus, knowing that these sources both give us a lens that helps us bring him into focus, but also at other times blurs him and distorts him. In the same way, it's clear that not everything that's in rabbinic literature originates in the time in which that literature takes shape, right? It's clear that whether we're talking about the Mishnah, whether we're talking about the Jerusalem Talmud, the Babylonian Talmud, that each of those works and any others you might think of is in conversation with tradition that already exists and is known. And whether that tradition can be recovered in a form earlier than this period is itself a question worth asking. And simply assuming that it can't, that we can only talk about these works as products of their time, I think is excluding a possible legitimate research avenue for scholarship.
What did the Pseudo-Clementine literature tell us about John?
Yeah, that's maybe the only, and certainly the most familiar form, if not the only, branch of the Christian tradition that ends up with a negative view of John the Baptist. Usually because of how Jesus spoke so highly of John the Baptist, the Christian tradition had nothing, they could downplay his significance in relation to Jesus, but they couldn't denigrate him because Jesus had praised him and had revered him. Somehow the Pseudo-Clementine literature managed to take a negative view of him, but it may be that that's precisely because, more so than the rest of the developing Christian tradition, there was direct connection and contact and engagement with ongoing groups of followers of John the Baptist. And so the Pseudo-Clementine literature traces the origins of Gnosticism to circles around John the Baptist. And on the one hand, it would be easy to say, well, that's just the Pseudo-Clementine literature, and why should we expect it to have any echo of history there? But there are other points of contact that also point to a connection with John the Baptist, right? The presence in so many Gnostic sources of rituals that include baptism, discussion of baptism and whether literal baptism or figurative baptism is needed and what its relationship is to spiritual experience, various other accoutrements of baptismal ritual, right? Whatever the bridal chamber is, and anointing and things of this sort. And so we get engagement with baptism and baptism as a practice all over the Gnostic tradition. And then we have Theodore Barconi in a Syriac Christian setting referring to the Mandaeans by a number of terms, but one of them is Dosthians, right? And so we have here him referring to them as Dosithians, and we have the Pseudo-Clementines, presumably with no connection that we can trace to Barconi, talking about Dosithius as a figure who is connected with John the Baptist movement. And then we also have Samaritan sources, not connecting with either of these, but referring to a Dustan sect, again, seems to be the Dosithian sect, and that they pray standing in water, right? And so we have all of these pieces that, each of them on its own might not help us to fill in the picture, but when we put them together, it seems like more than just, the connection seemed too coincidental, right? And seemed to converge on Dosithius and then John the Baptist and Gnosticism without any real effort, right? And each of them on their own would just be baffling and seemingly inexplicable. Like, what is this thing? Where does it come from? When we put them together and bring them together, it seems like we're seeing the ripples of John's impact through somebody named Dosithius, who had an influence in Samaria.
What do we know about Jesus being John's disciple?
Yeah, so often you'll hear that Jesus being baptized by John kind of is the crucial piece of evidence. And that does show that Jesus aligned with John's movement, but there were probably people who came to Jesus for healing, for whatever, and who then went their merry way. Jesus seems to associate with John. According to the Gospel of John, there's a period when Jesus is active as part of that movement. And although the Gospel of John depicts it as essentially Jesus becoming a sort of a breakaway movement, that seems to reflect, I think very clearly, a later perspective, right? And so we have Jesus as part of this movement, and we have Jesus associating himself with John the Baptist in a way that he doesn't associate himself with anyone else, right? And his contemporaries associated him in the same way. And so those things, I think, even more than the baptism, are what indicate that Jesus didn't just momentarily say, yeah, I appreciate what this guy's doing, but align himself more definitively with it. I saw in the chat that somebody said the Mandaeans adopted John the Baptist in 640 CE. That is not the consensus of scholars working in the field. Hope you won't mind me just throwing that in there. So, not sure if I'm supposed to be looking at the chat or not.
Oh no, it's fine. Can you tell us about the ancient infancy narrative of John the Baptist?
Yeah. So another, yeah, that I think that may have been the one I mentioned that could be a whole other area of study, could have been a whole other book in its own right. The Gospel of Luke has material that for a long time scholars have thought maybe this, the John the Baptist stuff at least goes back to a Baptist source, right? And when we talk about a Baptist source, this is not Luke saying, oh yeah, those Baptists over there, let's go and see if they've got anything useful that we could borrow. The Baptist tradition is what the Christian tradition emerges out of, right, as an offshoot. And so this is part of the heritage of what becomes Christianity, and not something that's borrowed from others. We also have the Mandaean material that's fascinating and in its difference as well as its intriguing similarities. But then the one other piece of the puzzle that hasn't been brought into direct connection for study along with Luke and the Mandaean Book of John is the Proto-Evangelium or Infancy Gospel of James, right? And there's long been consensus that at the end we're dealing with material that comes from a Baptist source, because suddenly Jesus drops out of the picture entirely, and it's all about John the Baptist as an infant and his mother and his father. And we have a martyrdom story about Zechariah. We have Elizabeth fleeing into the wilderness, and Herod is trying to kill John the Baptist because he thinks that John is going to rule Israel. And no one thinks that Christians would have come up with this, and so clearly this comes from a Baptist source. What hadn't been suggested previously, anywhere that I was able to find, is my proposed solution to this puzzling thing that appears at the end there, because why would someone take that material from a Baptist source and stick it awkwardly on the end of this Christian source, right? And so you have something baffling to do with the Baptist source and something baffling to do with the Christian source, if that's what it was. And so what I argue in the book, and I'll also be presenting on this in San Diego at ARSBL, is to argue that what we're dealing with there is what's known as editorial fatigue, right? And so rather than this being the appending of separate Baptist material to a Christian source, what we have here is the editor who has been reworking a Baptist source all throughout, saying, okay, well, here I can just use the original material in something closer to its earlier form and not adapting it as much. Right? And if we go back and revisit the earlier parts of the Infancy Gospel of James through that lens, then the striking similarity of the parents of Mary in this work to the parents of John the Baptist in Luke becomes explicable. And what I found was, I went into this particular part of the research project really skeptical of what one other person had done before, Hugh Schoenfeld, in merging these things together into one source, right? And I don't think that works, like just sticking them together, but that these are each on their own evidence of an underlying tradition that when we piece them together and relate them to one another, some of the puzzles of each of them can be solved by reference to the other. And so became persuaded that they do at least point to some underlying material, and that we can in fact trace at least the broad contours of what that John the Baptist focused infancy material looked like.
What is the origin and meaning of John's immersion?
Yeah, another big question. And I think that one widely held suggestion that regarding the significance of John's baptism that I think can be set aside is that it was simply another purity immersion, like others that were being practiced in that time. You don't get the nickname the Baptist. You don't have your authority to baptize challenged just because you are doing purity immersions that everyone is doing in a slightly different way. And so I think that John was taking this familiar act, something that people had become more and more accustomed to doing, and turns it into something with a different significance than it had in that time. And that may be why we never hear about him baptizing, immersing people in a mikveh, right, an immersion pool for purity immersion. It's always in rivers. He may have chosen rivers so that he could harness the familiar imagery of immersing in water and yet say something different and say that this can deal not only with impurity, right? I think he did say that it deals with that too, but also with sin. And so I think that John, in proclaiming what the Gospels call a baptism for the forgiveness of sins, was offering something that represented a direct challenge to the centrality of the temple and the sacrifices that people were accustomed to offering there.
What did the Mandaeans say about Jesus' baptism?
You get the sense they had real doubts about, even though they hold John in high esteem, they're really struggling to explain why John would have baptized this person who was bad news. And so, in the Great Treasure, we get the impression that John simply baptizes Jesus and then Jesus goes off the rails. In the Mandaean Book of John, I think it reflects a later development in that tradition, where they feel like John should have seen that this guy's going to be a problem, right? And so the baptismal account in the Mandaean Book of John probably is directly parodying the Christian account, and so may even reflect awareness specifically of Matthew's gospel, because in Matthew's gospel, John objects and says, I need to be baptized by you. Why are you coming to me? And in the Mandaean Book of John, John says, you're going to get up to no good. You're going to go off the rails, and this is... And it's actually really, I think, rather entertaining. John speaks in parables, right? Uses this imagery, and Jesus responds. Jesus, supposedly the master parable teller and storyteller, responds in this very woodenly literal way that misses John's point. And so, Mandaean polemic can be very pointed. They engage in a lot of almost farcical, comical, caricaturing of opponents and things like that. They do a lot of puns and wordplay, but they have their own version of it. And in the process, I think there too, even though it probably reflects knowledge of Christian storytelling and is engaging with it polemically, I think in their account of John's baptism of Jesus, we see that there was also some tradition that was embedded by an independent root, right, preserved among the Mandaeans, because one of the things that John criticizes Jesus for is that he looses the Sabbath that Moses ordained. And the Mandaeans, once they become a Gnostic movement, they don't hold a positive view of the Torah, right? And so clearly this comes from a period in the history of this movement when the material is taking shape in a context that is not Gnostic, right? And that does not reject the Torah. And that thought that John would criticize Jesus for not observing Torah rather than this being a sign that he's on the right track and maybe is connected with the being above Adonai and above the demiurgic powers that rule over this world. And so in that material, we see that you can have tradition, you can have storytelling that knows certain literature, and yet at the same time also knows other traditions, right? It's not once you show signs of dependence on another source, therefore you can't have known anything else, right? And while I understand why scholars sometimes, for convenience and for safety to some extent, will say, well, this is dependent on that, and so we then don't look to the second, the slightly later source for any independent material. But the truth is that that's not a methodologically sound way of proceeding.
Who is the Son of Man that is to come, and what does the Q source say about the Son of Man?
Yeah. So the Son of Man, is an expression that's fascinating because, on the one hand, Son of Man, right? A Son of Man is a human being, a person. That's how you say someone or one in Aramaic. It's a very common expression. It's all over Syriac literature and Aramaic, other dialects of Aramaic. And you get it even in the Syriac New Testament in places where you don't have Son of Man in the Greek New Testament, because you just couldn't put sentences together without saying this. And so, for instance, when Jesus is talking about the Sabbath, the Sabbath was not made for man, but man was not made for the Sabbath, but the Sabbath for man. Therefore, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. It's Son of Man all the way through in the Syriac, right? In the Syriac translation of the New Testament, because that's how you talk about a person, someone, a human being. And so the question is, why do the Gospels so consistently translate this Aramaic expression as though it had the definite article on it, right? As though it was in the emphatic state in Aramaic, right? And so, because that's a much more unusual formulation, because you don't talk about the someone or the one as often as you talk about one or someone. And so it's entirely plausible that Jesus spoke in this way, and that's maybe a separate question. But at the very least, by the time we get to Q and Mark, right, roughly around the same time period, and it's not clear that one of them knew the other, both are using this expression and rendering it in a similar way in Greek. And that suggests that in the underlying Aramaic, they understood there was an expression that was being used. And if Jesus was talking about the one, the someone, well, who is he talking about, right? Because anytime you have the one, whether it's in the Matrix movies or it's in any other context, you have an implicit the one who. And of course, John talked about the one who comes after me will be stronger than I. So talked about the coming stronger one, that someone who comes after him. And I think Jesus was echoing John's elusive phrase about someone who's coming after me, right? One of my disciples is going to prove stronger than me. And what we see in the Son of Man tradition, not just in Q, but throughout the Gospels, is that you get these three types of sayings. So there are the present sayings, which are the ones where on the one hand you can most plausibly render it as human being in a generic sense, and Jesus would have spoken that way. But you also have some indications that there's something more to it, that it's something more central to Jesus' identity. And of course, if it's alluding to John's coming one, then you have this sense that the authors of these early Christian texts are saying Jesus is that figure. And then you have the passion sayings, right? The Son of Man must suffer. And so the Son of Man, the one who is to come that John spoke about, is going to be more like John and is going to suffer in a way that John did, but in a way that people who followed John were not expecting the coming stronger one to do. And then you have the parousia sayings, right? The second coming sayings. When the Son of Man comes, he'll sit on his glorious throne. You will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power. And these are promises that even though it hasn't happened yet, Jesus will eventually do the things that John's stronger one was expected to do. And so when we bring John centrally into the Son of Man sayings, we have a solution to the things that have puzzled scholars most about this tradition. And so one of the things I'm really excited about and hope gets attention from New Testament scholars, including those who are more more interested in the Gospels and Jesus than in John the Baptist, is that they'll at least take a look at that chapter in this book that deals with the Son of Man tradition, because I think that this offers a solution to the longstanding Son of Man problem and can help explain the data in a more comprehensive way. Not that there are no loose ends, not as though there were no sayings that were invented that may be somewhat anomalous in that context, but it does justice to, I think, more of that tradition and more of the three types of sayings, and makes sense of why they're all in there better than some of the alternatives.
Does the transition of the temptation of Jesus to the Beatitudes complicate things in the Q source?
Yeah, I mean, they're puzzled about the Q source because this material, there are moments when there seems to be narrative, right? It starts off with some narrative content about John the Baptist, but then we have teaching, and there are clearly disjunctures in this, right? And if this material was never just a purely a saying source, then I think we have to resign ourselves to the fact that while some of that material we might eventually be able to make a case that this thing that's in Luke but not in Matthew was in Q, this thing that was in Matthew but not in Luke was in Q, but ultimately we don't have the whole thing. And so on the one hand, there does seem to be an awkward disjuncture there, so much so that there's this interesting case made by Claire Rothschild that all of this was originally a John the Baptist compilation and then got applied to Jesus. I think it's more likely that it was Jesus who was delivering the sayings material. And the reason why it's so similar to things that are also attributed to John in the tradition, and the reason why it comes so closely on the heels of material about John, is that the question this source was trying to answer was, how does Jesus relate to John? Why is Jesus the rightful person to become the leader of the John the Baptist movement? Some of this might have even started to develop during a time when Jesus was still present, right? And some of his emissaries were trying to make the case that people who were supporters of John should get behind his movement. And so the inclusion of material that shows what Jesus was teaching and highlights how it is consonant with what John taught, while perhaps also doing creative things on that foundation, that kind of material would make perfect sense within this framework.
So is Q really just a collection of sayings, or could it also be a narrative that contains sayings?
Yeah, I think it's a narrative that contains sayings. I think the evidence that we have points to it starting with John the Baptist and with some narrative material about him. And the fact that there's a lot of sayings content either indicates that this is a work that's composite in character, right? Or that we're missing some of that narrative that would have made sense of it, or that there was some overlap with Mark, and that's why we're not recognizing some of the framework for some of the sayings material. And it seems to me much more plausible that a Q source that had some sayings material that was directly relevant to the question of how Jesus related to John the Baptist would then have been supplemented by those who were eager to preserve Jesus's teaching. And so once you have some of the teaching of Jesus taking written form, then to say, well, but let's also add this in there. Let's also add that in there. And let's expand this work with more teaching is an entirely plausible way of envisaging the aggregate growth of the Q material, as it were.
You talk about the links between John the Baptist and the early Gnostics, the formation of Gnosticism.
Yeah, so to be clear, I think that the Mandaeans do have some sort of connection that goes back to John the Baptist, but I mean that in much the same way that one could say that there is probably some continuous thread of tradition that leads back from the Nag Hammadi sources, the Gnostic sources, to the historical Jesus, which doesn't mean that Jesus was a Gnostic, right? And I don't think John the Baptist was a Gnostic either, what it means is that there were people who became part of this movement who maybe had some slightly different views, and then their views evolved and things spread and things developed and maybe changes were introduced. And so we don't have to, it's not the case that the Gnostic forms of Christianity come about by some group of people who have no connection whatsoever with the Jesus tradition, then suddenly sort of borrowing him into an already existing Gnostic framework, right? This is a distinctive way of developing and reinterpreting the Jesus tradition that emerges as part of that diversity. And the fact that we get both Christian and apparently not Christian, yet with Jewish roots, versions of Gnosticism, I think indicates that we need to go back at least one step before Jesus in order to make sense of this. And doing that with John the Baptist and the entourage around him, I think, is precisely the way to explain that we have this Sethian tradition that emerges that has overlaps with Christian forms of Gnosticism. And sometimes you get Sethian texts that then incorporate Christian interpolations because there were Sethian Christians as well. This diversity of Gnosticism, I think, makes sense and can be made sense of if we connect it with the circles around John the Baptist, of which Jesus was a part, but also perhaps so were Dositheus and Simon of Samaria and people like that. And the other thing that the Mandaean sources let us figure out that I think can help us explain how Gnosticism comes about in the entourage around John the Baptist is that flowing into this is a very ancient tradition of rejecting the imposition of the Torah and of monotheism that was still to be found at the fringes of populations that we should define broadly, not just as Judean or Jewish, but Israelite. And so in places in Samaria, in Transjordan, in Egypt, in Babylonia, we know, right, without any doubt, because we have texts from there, that around the year 500 BC, there was in Elephantine in Egypt, there was a Jewish temple there, right? And they had preserved the earlier Israelite polytheism, right? Not necessarily that they preserved it exactly as it was during the time of the monarchy or something like that, but they had something that inherited and preserved elements of that were being eliminated, right, through the imposition of Torah by authorities based in Jerusalem. And so it's not a coincidence that Gnosticism emerges in Samaria, and we get in Babylonia and Mesopotamia, we get it in Egypt as some of the key places where this is thriving. And those are precisely the places where there were Israelites that had scattered, but who were less able to be to have imposed upon them by authorities in Jerusalem this new approach that focuses on one God alone. And so those people were still around, right? The fact that the temple in Elephantine stopped functioning doesn't mean that these views just vanished. And scholars of Gnosticism have puzzled over this, even when looking at the Coptic sources, have said, this looks a lot like that kind of stuff, and we don't know how it got here. And what the Mandaeans bring into the picture is, by preserving a Gnostic tradition within a Semitic linguistic environment, they're celestial beings, right? They're what the Greek and Coptic tradition call aeons, right? They're uthras, are beings with names like Yorba and Yoshamin, right? Yah the Great, Yah of Heaven, and Anat He, right? Anat of life. But Anat is this female deity that we get referenced in Ugaritic sources and other neighboring peoples, as well as getting indication that she was present in ancient Israel, right, before the monotheistic revolution took place. And so I think what happened was that John, in his activity in out of the way places, intersected with people who held these views, and maybe if it wasn't Dositheus or Simon of Samaria, then we'd need to invent someone else to play the same role. But why not just say that maybe this tradition is correct and it was them? But someone who was educated, who maybe also had learned some Greek philosophy, which you also could do in this part of the world, and who had this Israelite heritage, and puts those things together with John's baptism and the mystical emphases of each of these and ties them together. And so I think that Mandaean sources, in addition to having something useful to say when used critically about Christian origins and getting behind them to John the Baptist, they also help us answer longstanding puzzles about the origins of Gnosticism. And that's something that I hope will also get some scholars in fields other than the specifically Mandaean focused sort of area to pay more attention to these sources and realize that they have something to contribute that's really quite important.
I Fish No Tie, thank you for your super chat. Thoughts on the Suba Cave, Butler Bulldog for life?
Yeah. Oh, always happy to answer a Butler Bulldog for life. Yeah. So almost had the chance to visit the Suba Cave. Met with Shimon Gibson when I was working on this book project. But there had recently been a fire in the area, and in putting out the fire, there had been a lot of water and flooding, and so it was just a mess there, and it was not able to visit it. I don't think if I'd gone in, I would have seen anything that isn't described more clearly and photographed more effectively in the books. So it's not clear to me that the evidence in any kind of definitive way shows us this particular place was directly connected with John the Baptist. But what seems to me entirely plausible is that this is yet another example of the influence of John, that here we have some evidence, whether direct or indirect, of John the Baptist's influence and the kinds of movements that emerged out of his impact. When we think that we get Christianity, we get Gnosticism, we get apparently non-Gnostic Dosithians who are praying standing in water, but who hold Mount Gerizim in high esteem. We get the Elkasites, right, who are Christian, but also are immersing more regularly than became the norm in Christian baptism. And so, however the Suba Cave fits into the picture, I think it does fit into this picture, right? And I think that more study of that location, more deductive work on what the ritual might have been that might have been practiced there, working out whether pottery shards and other things found there actually do provide indication of the ritual use of the cave, and if so, in what way. All of this deserves further study. I don't see anything that definitively points to a direct connection with John, but that doesn't mean it's not important for triangulating back on him. Go Dogs.
I Fish No Tie, thank you for another super chat. Were Jesus and John influenced by the Essenes?
Yeah, so I think there's definitely influence, and there's definitely conversation going on and engagement. Some have said, and if you visit Qumran, they'll actually present you a little movie that assumes this to have been the case. Some have assumed that John's wilderness was the Judean desert, and that John probably spent some time at Qumran. And there, I don't think there is evidence to support that, not least because I think that the differences between John and the folks at Qumran are rather like the differences between Jesus and the Pharisees, right? There's a lot of similarity. There's a lot of common ground. And there's clearly intense dialogue precisely because they share a lot in common, but the differences are also just as important. And so I think that given that Essenes were not just located at Qumran, and they were represented all throughout the regions where you had a Jewish population, that John may well have encountered them. Jesus certainly encountered them. And we have one fairly direct reference in the Gospels to the Essenes, it would seem, right? When Jesus says, which of you, if their sheep falls into a pit on the Sabbath, would not pull the sheep out? And the answer was the Essenes, right? It's explicitly addressed in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And so Jesus was essentially saying to non-Essenes in his entourage, you don't go to that extreme, and so stop pretending that you are taking this to the furthest extreme possible, right? There's wiggle room here. You don't go that far, and so why do you go as far as you do, and why not make allowance for doing good on the Sabbath in these other ways as well, right? Because you're not going to the furthest extreme possible, and so don't pretend that you are the default position. And if Jesus in that regard reflects the influence of his mentor, then presumably John disagreed with the Essenes on some other things, in addition to baptism, purity, wearing. It's not clear what they thought about the hair, wearing the hair of camels, but certainly the skin of camels would have been out of the question. Whether that meant they wouldn't wear. We haven't found camel hair garments of any sort at Qumran, unless I'm mistaken, and so I think the differences are as important as the similarities.
Fish and Ty, thank you for yet another super chat. Our research ossuaries are the parents of John, Zechariah, and Elizabeth.
Those are the names given to them in the Gospel of Luke and later Christian tradition. In Mandaean sources, we get essentially the same names, but it's Zachariah, right, and Enishbai, which is interesting because if they had been borrowing the names from, say, Syriac Gospels or something like that, and borrowing John and his parents, then we'd expect them to use the same forms of the names that we get in Christian tradition. And so that different form of John's mother's name suggests to me that there's separate linguistic development, right, as the name gets passed on and as the dialect of Aramaic that is preserved in undergoes transformation. So I think this person, who I gather is also the Butler Bulldog for life, is very interested in a lot of aspects of this. And so I have an online social media presence, and you can find my contact information on the Butler website. So I hope this person will get in touch, because I'm particularly intrigued by this question about the ossuaries, right? If there are ossuaries around, there have been some ossuaries found with some interesting names that intersect with biblical tradition, and interested in hearing more about what's being done and what's happening. So.
And I like to remind everybody that the History Valley Amazon affiliate link to get John of History and pre-order it is in the description below. It's also pinned in the live chat, and it will be in the pinned comment just below the description of the video. Well, thanks for joining me today, James.
Oh, it's been a pleasure. I really enjoyed our conversation, and so delighted that there seems to be so much interest in John the Baptist. I think he deserves the attention.
Likewise. Thanks.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.